The control room at NASA's Deep Space Command was alive with the hum of monitors and the low murmur of engineers exchanging data reports. For weeks, communication with Aurora 7, the first self-sustaining Mars colony, had been routine. Daily status updates, oxygen level checks, and progress reports. Nothing had been out of the ordinary. The colony was thriving, its crew of 42 men and women pioneering humanity's first steps toward interplanetary survival. Then, at 3:13 a.m., everything changed. "This is Aurora 7. We need immediate, static, oh god, they're inside. We sealed the main bay, but it's not holding." The transmission cut short. At first, the team assumed it was a technical glitch. Mars dust storms had interfered with satellite relays before. But then came the second signal, a garbled, nightmarish distortion of sound that sent chills through the control room. It wasn't just static. It was whispers. Hundreds of voices, layered over one another, speaking in an unknown language. Some sounded desperate, others amused. Then, one voice rose above the others. Distorted, inhuman, and unnervingly clear. "We never left." The line went dead. Frantic attempts to reconnect were met with silence. The Aurora 7 colony, all 42 members, was gone. NASA's AI systems had automatically recorded the last visual transmission before the blackout. When the team reviewed it, a sense of unease spread through the room. The camera, positioned outside the colony's main habitat, showed the airlock doors wide open, flapping slightly from the weak Martian wind. The lights inside flickered. Beyond the doors, shadows moved, but not in a way that made sense. They twisted and bent, as if something was crawling across the walls. In the lower right corner of the screen, a single word was scratched into the dust covering the habitat floor. "Run." A wave of nausea hit one of the engineers. Another turned away from the screen, his hands trembling. The image itself wasn't violent. There were no bodies, no blood, nothing tangible to suggest an attack. And yet, the feeling it evoked was worse than any massacre. It was the terror of something unseen, something waiting. The U.S. government immediately classified the event. The media was told there was a malfunction with Aurora 7's communications array. The public remained unaware. But behind closed doors, a desperate plan was formed. The colony had cost billions of dollars, and more than that, it had become a symbol of humanity's expansion beyond Earth. Losing contact with it wasn't an option. They had to send a rescue team. A 6-person crew, made up of NASA's best engineers and ex-military personnel, was chosen. Their mission: find out what happened and bring back survivors, if there were any left. They would be briefed on the transmission, but certain details, like the whispers, were omitted. Officials feared that if the team knew too much, they might refuse to go. The launch was set for 48 hours later. Then another signal came through. It lasted exactly 4 seconds. A single, ragged breath, followed by a whispered plea. "Don't come." The voice was barely recognizable, but audio analysis suggested it belonged to Dr. Karen Elridge, Aurora 7's lead biologist. She had spoken in a low, broken whisper, as if she was hiding from something. NASA officials hesitated. The message could mean anything. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was a trap. But in the end, it didn't matter. The decision had already been made. The rescue mission was on its way. As the crew prepared for launch, one of the engineers, a man named Carter Hayes, sat alone in the break room, replaying the last audio transmission over and over. Something about the way she had spoken unnerved him. The sound of her breath, the way she had whispered. He turned up the volume, listening carefully. That's when he heard it. A second breath. Someone, something, had been right behind her. Carter's stomach turned to ice. He rushed to the control room, but it was too late. The shuttle had already launched, carrying the rescue team toward Mars. Toward the unknown. The rescue shuttle, Odyssey 3, hurtled through the void of space, cutting across the darkness like a silver blade. It was a 6-month journey to Mars. But for the 6 crew members on board, time seemed to move in uneasy silence. None of them spoke about the transmission. They had all seen the classified video, heard the whispers, and read the reports that made their stomachs churn. The official story was simple. Aurora 7 had suffered a catastrophic failure, but no one believed that. Commander Ethan Graves sat in the cockpit, staring at the endless black beyond the reinforced glass. He had seen war, been through hell, but nothing had ever unsettled him like this mission. Across from him, Dr. Melissa Carter, the team's lead scientist, was reviewing atmospheric reports from Aurora 7's last known data log. Everything had been normal until the moment it wasn't. Behind them, Lieutenant Jason O'Malley, the mission's security officer, double-checked his weapon for the 10th time that day. Firearms weren't usually allowed on space missions, but the higher-ups had made an exception. For safety reasons, they said. But safety from what? The rest of the crew, Dr. Ian Patel, engineer Sophie Lane, and pilot Mark Rodriguez, were scattered throughout the shuttle, lost in their own thoughts. The closer they got to Mars, the heavier the air inside Odyssey 3 became. It wasn't just the pressure. It was the feeling that they were going towards something they shouldn't. By the time they entered orbit, all communications with Earth had begun to break up. It started as mild interference, static crackling in their earpieces. But as they prepared for descent, the interference turned into whispers. Rodriguez was the first to notice. Mission control were picking up, he stopped. His brow furrowed as he listened. The whispers were faint at first, but they grew louder the longer the signal remained open. Then one of the voices spoke directly to him. Mark. He jolted back in his seat. The voice had been right in his ear, soft but unmistakable. Someone, or something, knew his name. His hands trembled as he cut the channel. The others noticed his reaction but said nothing. No one wanted to admit they had heard it too. The descent to Mars was rough. The planet's thin atmosphere made for a violent entry, shaking the shuttle hard enough to make Sophie curse under her breath. When they finally broke through the clouds of red dust and the colony came into view, everyone fell silent. Aurora 7 was intact. There were no signs of an explosion. No structural damage. The domed habitat stood undisturbed in the middle of the Martian landscape, exactly as it had been before the last transmission. But there was no movement. No welcoming crew. No signs of life. As they landed a few hundred meters from the habitat, the dust swirled violently around them, obscuring their vision. O'Malley was the first to step out, weapon at the ready. The silence was suffocating. The doors to the main habitat were wide open, just like in the last transmission. As they approached, the unsettling feeling in their chests deepened. There were no footprints leading in or out of the habitat. The dust had settled untouched. It was as if no one had left the structure in days. Graves took point, signaling the team forward. The moment they stepped inside, the temperature dropped. The air was stale, heavy with something they couldn't quite place. Then they saw it. The last message. On the metal walls, scratched in deep, jagged letters, were the words, "We never left." Melissa exhaled sharply. O'Malley's grip on his weapon tightened. "Where the hell is everyone?" Patel whispered. There was no answer. Just the faint hum of dead electronics. The power was still running, but the lights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows that moved just a little too much. They split into pairs. Graves and O'Malley secured the main living quarters. Rodriguez and Sophie checked the control room, while Melissa and Patel examined the lab. Rodriguez approached the console and tried to access the last logs, but the system refused to respond. Every file had been wiped, replaced by corrupt data streams looping the same distorted video. It was security footage from inside the habitat. The team gathered around as he played it back. At first, everything seemed normal. Aurora 7's crew were going about their daily routines, eating, laughing, checking instruments. Then, at 3:13 a.m., a shadow passed over the camera. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, motionless, watching. It wasn't wearing a spacesuit. It wasn't part of the crew. Then the footage glitched. When it resumed, the crew was gone. The hallways were empty. The only thing left was the figure, still standing in the same spot. Only now it was facing the camera. Melissa's breath hitched. "Pause it." Rodriguez froze the frame. The figure's face was barely visible, shrouded in darkness. But its eyes were wide, black voids, staring straight ahead, unblinking. Then, as if responding to them, the screen flickered. The figure twitched. And suddenly, the camera feed wasn't footage anymore. It was live. The timestamp at the bottom of the screen showed the current time. The camera was in one of the habitat's hallways. And the figure was still there, standing in the shadows, watching them. O'Malley spun, gun raised, pointing toward the nearest hallway. The rest of the team backed away from the screen, their blood running cold. A long, piercing shriek echoed from deep within the habitat. Not human. Not animal. Something else. Then the lights went out. The emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the corridor in a sickly red glow. The team froze, their breath shallow, the echoes of the inhuman scream still ringing in their ears. The habitat, once a silent tomb, now felt alive, as if something had awakened the moment they set foot inside. O'Malley moved first, his training kicking in. He raised his rifle toward the corridor where the sound had come from. Eyes up. No one moves alone. His voice was steady, but his grip on the weapon was tight, his knuckles pale. Graves scanned the room, forcing himself to focus. Rodriguez, can you bring the power back up? Rodriguez shook his head, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the console. It's not responding. The entire system is fried. But that, he gestured at the frozen live feed on the monitor, where the figure still stood in the hallway, unmoving. That shouldn't be possible. If the cameras are working, the power's not fully gone. Melissa stepped closer to the screen, staring at the timestamp. If this is live, that thing is still here. A heavy silence settled over them. Then the screen glitched. The figure tilted its head, slowly, unnaturally, as if it could see them watching. Then the screen went black. Sophie swore under her breath. I don't like this. We need to get the hell out of here. Graves clenched his jaw. Not until we find out what happened to the Aurora 7 crew. He turned to Patel and Melissa. Check the living quarters. If there's any trace of them, I want to know. Melissa hesitated. And if there isn't, Graves didn't answer. With a reluctant nod, she and Patel stepped into the darkened corridor, their flashlights casting long, wavering beams of light along the walls. The air inside the habitat was still, yet it felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. The living quarters were pristine. Too pristine. The beds were neatly made, belongings tucked away as if the crew had simply stepped out for a meeting. No signs of struggle. No blood. No bodies. Just absence. Patel's fingers skimmed over a bedside table, his skin prickling. It's like they were never here. Melissa frowned. No. It's like they were here one moment, and gone the next. A faint tapping sound echoed through the room. They spun around, flashlights sweeping across the walls. Nothing. Then Patel noticed something. The small mirror above the sink, one of the few reflective surfaces in the habitat. His breath caught. Melissa, his voice was barely a whisper. She followed his gaze to the mirror. At first, it reflected only their own panicked faces. Then the light flickered. For the briefest second, there was a third figure standing behind them. Tall. Wrong. Eyes like voids. Then it was gone. Patel staggered back, knocking over a chair. Melissa grabbed his arm, her own pulse hammering. We're leaving. Now. They rushed out of the living quarters, nearly colliding with Graves and O'Malley. We're not alone, Melissa panted. Something's here. We know, O'Malley muttered, nodding toward Rodriguez. The engineer's face was drained of all color. Tell them. Rodriguez swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the console's edge. I pulled up some of the corrupted logs. There's one file that wasn't wiped. He tapped a key, and the speakers crackled to life. A recorded voice message. It was Dr. Karen Elridge, Aurora 7's lead biologist. Her voice was rugged, barely above a whisper. If you're hearing this, leave. No. Don't look for us. Don't try to understand. Just go. A pause. A shuddering breath. Then. It's not the air. It's not radiation. It's not madness. It's them. The things in the dark. They don't kill you. They take you. And once they do, you're still there, but you're not you anymore. A static-laced sob. We never should have come here. This place isn't empty. It never was. Silence. Then a second voice, distorted, layered, inhuman. We never left. The recording cut off. No one spoke. No one breathed. Then the radio at O'Malley's hip crackled. A voice, whispering, familiar. Don't run. O'Malley's blood turned to ice. He knew that voice. It was his own. Then something moved in the corridor. Not footsteps. Not breathing. Just a shifting of shadows. Rodriguez let out a strangled gasp. Did you? The lights flickered again. For a heartbeat, they saw them. Dozens of figures standing at the far end of the hallway. Silent. Unmoving. Some wore tattered Aurora 7 uniforms. Some did not. Their eyes, bottomless voids, watched. Then the lights went out completely. O'Malley fired. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness, revealing glimpses of twisted, shifting shapes. Not quite human. Not quite something else. Then the gun jammed. A whisper, right next to his ear. We told you not to come. A cold hand closed around his wrist. O'Malley screamed. The gunshot's echo barely faded before O'Malley's scream tore through the darkness. The team lunged toward him, but his body was yanked into the shadows, vanishing as if swallowed by the habitat itself. No. Graves lunged after him, his hand grasping at empty air. O'Malley was gone. The emergency lights flickered back on for only a second. That was enough. The hallway was empty. No figures. No shadows. No O'Malley. Only the distant, faint sound of footsteps, retreating deeper into the habitat. Rodriguez was shaking violently, his breath coming in gasps. We have to go. We have to go. Melissa's eyes darted between the empty corridor and the panicked team. She wanted to run, every part of her screaming to get out, get off this planet, never look back. But O'Malley was still here. Somewhere. Graves clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think. We're not leaving him. Rodriguez snapped. He's gone, Graves. Just like the others. You saw what took him. A moment of silence. Then, from deep within the habitat, O'Malley's voice. Commander. They all turned, eyes wide, staring into the corridor. The voice was faint. Hollow. Wrong. Graves. Graves swallowed hard. O'Malley. A pause. Then closer this time. Why did you let me go? The words sent a chill through all of them. Something wasn't right. Rodriguez shook his head violently. That's not him. That's not him. Sophie took a step back, her eyes darting toward the exit. We need to go. We need to go right now. But Graves couldn't move. His gut told him Rodriguez was right. Whatever was calling to them wasn't O'Malley. But what if it was? Another sound drifted through the hall. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. And then, from the dimly lit corridor ahead, he stepped into view. O'Malley. But not. His uniform was torn, dirt smeared across his face. His head was tilted slightly, as if his neck couldn't quite support it. His arms hung limply at his sides, his fingers twitching. But it was his eyes that stopped them cold. Gone was the sharp focus of a trained officer. Instead, his pupils were dilated, endless pools of black. His lips twitched into a hollow smile. Why did you let me go? He asked again, his voice layered, like multiple voices speaking at once. Rodriguez let out a choked gasp. That's not him. Graves took a slow step forward, every instinct screaming at him to run. O'Malley? O'Malley's head snapped toward him at a sickening angle. His smile widened. We never left. Then he lunged. A blur of motion too fast for a human body. Melissa screamed as O'Malley crashed into Graves, knocking him to the floor. His fingers, too cold, too strong, dug into the commander's shoulders. Rodriguez reacted first. He grabbed a nearby metal pipe and swung. The impact snapped O'Malley's head to the side, but he didn't make a sound. Didn't react at all. Instead, he turned back toward Rodriguez. Smiling. Rodriguez's breath hitched. Jesus Christ. Graves kicked out, throwing O'Malley off him. The moment he hit the ground, the shadows around him seemed to move, pulling him back, deeper into the habitat. O'Malley didn't fight it. Didn't resist. He just stared at them with those empty black eyes, his smile never fading. Then he was gone. No one spoke. No one breathed. Finally, Graves pushed himself up, his hands shaking. "We're leaving. Right now. No arguments. No hesitation." The team ran. They sprinted through the corridors, back toward the exit. The shadows seemed to pulse around them, shifting unnaturally. The emergency lights flickered, casting terrifying glimpses of movement in the walls. They weren't alone. As they neared the airlock, the static in their comms flared to life. A chorus of voices whispered at once. "Don't leave us. Stay. Join us." Rodriguez nearly dropped his communicator. "Shut it off. Shut it off." Sophie hit the airlock controls. The door hissed open, revealing the Martian landscape beyond. A few more steps. They were so close. Then the lights died completely. For a fraction of a second, it was pitch black. Then, the entire habitat exploded with movement. Figures, dozens, maybe hundreds, poured from the hallways. Not running. Gliding. Silent. Watching. Some of them were Aurora 7's crew. Their faces twisted into empty masks of blank smiles and blackened eyes. Others were something else. Sophie screamed. Graves grabbed her wrist and yanked her forward. "Go!" They burst through the airlock, slamming their boots into the Martian dust. Rodriguez hit the control panel, sealing the door behind them. For a moment, nothing moved. The red sands stretched empty before them. Then Melissa turned. Her stomach dropped. The habitat's windows were filled with faces. Hundreds of them. Pressed against the glass. Smiling. Some were human. Some were not. One figure stood in the center. O'Malley. His head tilted slightly. His lips curled into that same, hollow smile. Then, he lifted a single hand, placing it against the glass. Behind him, the other figures did the same. Rodriguez let out a choked sob. "What the hell is this?" Graves stared at the silent, watching figures. Then, slowly, he reached for his communicator. He switched to the emergency broadcast frequency. "Odyssey 3 to mission control," he said, his voice steady despite the horror sinking into his bones. "Aurora 7 is compromised. The colony is not abandoned." He looked back toward the glass. O'Malley's head tilted further. "We were wrong. This place was never empty." His fingers trembled as he pressed the final transmission button. "We are not alone on Mars." The silence on Mars was different now. It wasn't the usual quiet of an uninhabited planet. It was a watching silence, heavy, filled with an unseen presence pressing in on the remaining crew. Graves' hands were still shaking as he lowered his communicator. The emergency signal had been sent, but deep down he already knew no one was coming. Not in time. Sophie was staring at the habitat's windows. The faces were still there, pressed against the glass, unmoving. The hundreds of empty eyes locked onto them with unnatural focus. Rodriguez took a shaky step forward. "They're not attacking." Melissa's voice was barely a whisper. "Because they don't have to." She was right. The crew of Aurora 7 had never left. They had been changed. And the same thing was happening to them. A sudden sharp pain bloomed in Graves' head, sending him to his knees. It was like something crawling behind his eyes, burrowing deeper. Sophie gasped, clutching her skull. Rodriguez let out a strangled cry. Melissa barely managed to choke out the words. "It's inside us." The realization struck like a lightning bolt. The moment they stepped into the habitat, it had started. It wasn't an infection. It wasn't a virus. It was something else. A presence. A force. A consciousness woven into Mars itself. Graves' vision blurred. The whispers returned. "Stay. Become." The voices were warm now, coaxing. Almost welcoming. Rodriguez clawed at his ears. "Get out of my head." Graves forced himself to his feet. He fought against the fog in his mind, against the pull. Something was trying to rewrite him, overwrite him. They needed to get out. No. Back to the Odyssey, he ordered through clenched teeth. Rodriguez hesitated. But Graves grabbed his shoulder. Now. The team turned toward the rover. The vast Martian wasteland stretched ahead, the Odyssey 3 lander just over the horizon. It wasn't far. But something was waiting. Footprints. They weren't there before. A long, winding trail of them, leading from the habitat toward the Odyssey. Rodriguez paled. No. No, no, no. Then the figures stepped into view. The crew of Aurora 7. Dozens of them. Some barely recognizable. Their features warped, stretched, wrong. Their bodies moved unnaturally, as if learning how to walk again. And leading them O'Malley. He was smiling. His black eyes locked onto Graves. "You're almost ready," he said, his voice layered with too many voices. A single step forward. Then another. The others followed. Graves made a decision in an instant. Run. They sprinted toward the rover. The figures moved too, matching their speed, but never running. They didn't have to, because the whispers were getting louder. Rodriguez tripped, slamming into the ground. Ack. Sophie grabbed his arm, pulling him up, but it was too late. A hand closed around his ankle. Rodriguez let out a horrified scream. It was one of them. A former crew member, face partially dissolved into black veins. Rodriguez kicked wildly. "Let go." Graves grabbed a wrench from his belt and swung. The impact cracked the figure's skull, but there was no blood, no reaction. The thing smiled, and held on tighter. More hands reached forward. Sophie grabbed Rodriguez's arm. "We're not leaving you." Rodriguez's expression twisted in pain. "You have to." Melissa was already raising her sidearm. "I got it." Before anyone could react, she fired. The shot hit Rodriguez's captor in the head. The figure jerked back, releasing him. Rodriguez scrambled to his feet, panting. Graves pulled him forward. "Move. Move." They burst into the rover, sealing the hatch just as the first figures reached them. Thud. Hands pressed against the glass. Blackened, twisted hands. They didn't pound. They didn't try to break in. They just watched. O'Malley's face appeared in the window. Still smiling. "You can't leave," he whispered through the glass. "You belong here." Graves slammed the accelerator. The rover lurched forward, tires kicking up dust. The figures didn't chase. They just stood there, watching as the team drove toward the Odyssey. And the whispers didn't stop. They couldn't escape them. Rodriguez wiped a shaking hand down his face. "We're not gonna make it." Graves tightened his grip on the wheel. "Yes, we are." Melissa turned back toward the habitat. The figures were still there, still watching. But something was moving beneath the sand. A shape. A pulse. A presence. Melissa's voice was barely a whisper. "This planet is alive." No one argued. Because they knew she was right. Something wasn't just on Mars. It was Mars. And it was waiting for them to return. Graves floored the accelerator. The Odyssey was close now. Just a little further. But the whispers weren't letting go. They pressed into his mind, his thoughts. Stay. Become. Join us. Graves clenched his teeth, fighting the pull. He wasn't going to become one of them. He wasn't going to die here. Not today. Not ever. He could see the Odyssey's hatch now. Their only way out. They had to make it. Or Mars would take them all. The Odyssey 3 lander stood in the distance, its metallic hull reflecting the pale red light of Mars' eternal dusk. It was so close now, a towering beacon of salvation amidst the endless, cursed wasteland. Graves tightened his grip on the rover's controls, his knuckles white. Just a little further. Behind them, the habitat and its inhuman occupants faded into the dust. The whispers remained, clawing at their minds, writhing beneath their thoughts like parasites. Sophie's breathing was ragged. "I still hear them." Rodriguez pressed his palms to his ears. "They're getting louder." Melissa turned, staring out the rear window. The figures were no longer standing still. They were walking. Not running. Not sprinting. Just walking. And yet, they were keeping up. The rover's wheels skidded across the rocky terrain as Graves pushed the engine to its limits. The Odyssey 3 was almost within reach, its airlock a promise of escape. Then, the ground shifted. Not just the sand. The planet itself moved beneath them. The rover bucked violently, nearly flipping over. Graves fought the controls. "Hang on." A deep thunderous vibration rumbled beneath them, spreading like a pulse across the landscape. The whispers became screams. Something was waking up. Melissa's voice was hoarse. Oh my God. The sand split open. A black chasm yawned in front of them, stretching across the path, directly between them and the Odyssey. Rodriguez's eyes widened. No. No, no, no. The rover was moving too fast to stop. Graves yanked the controls hard, sending the vehicle into a wild skid. The tires screeched against the rock as it spun sideways, right toward the edge. A moment of weightlessness. The rover tilted, the front wheels dangling over the abyss. Sophie screamed. Rodriguez grabbed the dashboard. We're tipping. Graves slammed his foot on reverse. The engine roared, the back tires kicking up dust. For a second, it seemed like they would fall. Then, the rear wheels caught traction. The rover lurched back onto solid ground. Everyone gasped for air. Sophie's hands were shaking. We almost. No time, Graves cut her off, already unbuckling. We go on foot. Rodriguez stared at the chasm ahead. We can't jump that. Graves pointed to a narrow section a few meters away. There. Melissa's face darkened. We don't have another option. They grabbed their gear and scrambled out of the rover. Behind them, the figures were still approaching. Rodriguez's breath hitched. They're getting. Then they stopped. The figures stood at the edge of the dust storm, watching. Waiting. Like they knew something the crew didn't. Graves didn't trust it. Move. They ran. The ground was shaking beneath them, the deep rumbling growing stronger. The chasm widened, inch by inch. It was now or never. Graves was the first to leap. For a split second, he was airborne, free-falling over an endless pit of darkness. Then, his boots slammed onto the other side. He hit the ground hard, rolling. Alive. Sophie jumped next, barely making it, landing with a yelp. Melissa followed, gritting her teeth. Rodriguez hesitated. Then, the whispers hit him. His expression twisted in agony. I can't. His hands went to his head. Graves' eyes widened. Rodriguez moved. Rodriguez looked up. His pupils were dilated, unfocused. Then, he stepped back. Melissa's face turned pale. No. Rodriguez smiled. Not his usual smile. A twisted, unnatural grin. His lips moved, but it wasn't his voice anymore. You don't have to run. Then, his body stiffened, and he collapsed into the dust. Lifeless. A horrifying second of silence. Then, his eyes snapped open. Pitch black. Sophie let out a strangled gasp. Rodriguez rose to his feet, slow, deliberate. And then he walked away. Back toward the figures. Back toward the whispers. Graves clenched his fists. No. No. Melissa grabbed his arm. We have to go. Graves' chest burned with guilt, but she was right. Rodriguez was gone. And if they didn't move, they would be too. They turned and ran for the Odyssey. The chasm groaned behind them, widening further. Graves' boots hit the ramp first, slamming the console. The airlock hissed open. They rushed inside, lungs burning. The door sealed shut. For a long, agonizing second, only the sound of their ragged breathing filled the cabin. Sophie let out a sob, hands shaking. Rodriguez. Melissa's gaze stayed on the door. It wasn't him anymore. Graves swallowed hard. He knew she was right. But he could still hear Rodriguez's voice in his mind. You don't have to run. He shook the thought away and moved to the cockpit. Strap in. We're leaving. Sophie's hands trembled as she buckled in. Melissa sat beside Graves, eyes scanning the systems. Everything looks functional. Graves took a deep breath. Engaging thrusters. The Odyssey shuddered. The ground rumbled violently. Outside the window, the figures were approaching. Rodriguez was among them now. They stared, waiting. Graves gritted his teeth. Burning thrusters now. The Odyssey roared to life. The dust storm outside swirled wildly as the ship's engines ignited. The figures didn't move. Even as the Odyssey lifted off. Even as they rose higher, away from the planet's surface. They just watched. Then, Rodriguez raised a hand. Not to wave. To point. Right at Graves. His lips moved, but no sound came through. Graves didn't need to hear it. He already knew what it meant. You'll be back. Then Mars was gone. The Odyssey pierced the atmosphere, breaking free from the cursed planet's grip. Sophie let out a shaking sob of relief. We made it. Melissa exhaled. Yeah. But Graves said nothing. Because as they drifted toward open space, as the comms reconnected with Earth, as safety finally came within reach, the whispers didn't stop. Not completely. Somewhere, in the deepest part of his mind, they were still there, waiting. And for the first time, Graves had a terrible, sinking thought. What if they never left Mars at all? The Odyssey 3 drifted in the cold silence of space, its engines humming softly as it made its journey home. Earth was still weeks away, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the crew was safe. Or so they thought. Graves sat in the dimly lit cockpit, staring at the planet growing smaller behind them. Mars. He should have felt relief. Instead, all he felt was dread. A gnawing, inescapable sensation clawing at the back of his skull. Like something was still watching. Behind him, Sophie and Melissa sat in tense silence. No one had spoken since the launch. No one dared. Because the truth was, they all felt it. The whispers might have faded, but their presence lingered. It was in the flickering shadows. In the occasional glitch of the ship's monitors. In the way none of them could sleep without feeling something breathing down their necks. And then, the comms crackled. The sudden noise made Graves flinch. A burst of static. Then a voice. Odyssey 3, this is Mission Control. Do you copy? Melissa exhaled in relief. Finally, Graves hit the switch. Mission Control, we copy. A pause. Then, what happened down there? Sophie turned pale. Graves didn't answer right away. What could he say? That they found something that shouldn't exist? That Rodriguez was gone, claimed by an unseen force? That the Mars colony hadn't simply disappeared. It had become something else? Something waiting. Something that almost took them to. Melissa leaned forward. Mission Control, we lost contact with the colony before arrival. When we landed, the settlement was abandoned. Another pause. Too long of a pause. Then, that's not possible. A cold chill ran down Graves' spine. He glanced at Melissa. What do you mean? The voice on the other end hesitated. Then, Odyssey 3, we've been receiving transmissions from the colony all week. Sophie froze. Melissa's face went pale. What? The colony has been active. Routine check-ins. Status reports. Everything looks normal on our end. A deep, suffocating silence filled the cockpit. Graves' heart pounded. That's not possible. Melissa's voice shook. We were there. The place was empty. Everyone was. She cut herself off. Because they didn't find any bodies. No sign of a struggle. Just an empty colony. And now Mission Control was saying it was still active. Sophie's breathing quickened. That's not them. Graves swallowed hard. Mission Control, you need to check the transmissions. Whoever's sending them, it's not the colony. A sharp burst of static filled the channel. Then, laughter. Low. Distorted. Inhuman. Sophie gasped and covered her mouth. Melissa's hands curled into fists. Who is this? The laughter faded into whispers. Not words. Not a voice. Just a presence. The lights flickered. A chill spread through the cabin. Graves' breath hitched. And then, finally, a final transmission came through. A voice. Familiar. Rodriguez. But it wasn't really him anymore. You don't have to run. Sophie let out a strangled sob. Melissa's face twisted in horror. Graves clenched his jaw, his mind racing. Rodriguez was dead. He saw him fall. He saw him change. But here he was, his voice echoing from the comms, as if he had never left. As if he had become one of them. Then static. And silence. The connection cut off. Mission Control was gone. The ship's monitors flickered wildly, random symbols flashing across the screen. The temperature dropped rapidly, their breath turning into mist. And then, a new message appeared on the main screen. A warning. Not from mission control. Not from anyone on Earth. From Mars. 3 words. You brought it. Graves' blood turned to ice. Melissa's voice was barely a whisper. No, 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 no. Sophie screamed. Then, the lights went out. The ship lurched violently, sending them crashing into their seats. The hum of the engines became distorted, wrong, like something else was in the system. Graves fumbled for control, his hands shaking, rebooting power. Then, a voice. Close. Inside the ship. Right behind him. You never left. Graves whipped around and saw Rodriguez, standing in the darkness, eyes black as the void, smiling. And then, everything went dark.